The most famous city in the history of the world has never been fully excavated. The reason is not a government decision. It is not a political restriction. It is not classified. The oldest layers of Babylon, the original city, the settlement that existed for centuries before Nebuchadnezzar, before the Tower of Babel, before everything the Bible describes, are sitting beneath the water table. They are physically unreachable, and they have been unreachable since the first archaeologist stepped off a boat on the Euphrates in 1899. 126 years of excavation, and the oldest part of the most famous city in history has never been touched. The name alone carries weight that almost no other word in human history carries: Babylon. It appears in the Bible more than 200 times. It appears in Greek histories, Roman texts, Persian records, and Assyrian chronicles. It was the capital of an empire that controlled most of the known world at its peak. It was the city where Alexander the Great died in 323 BCE in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar at the age of 32. It gave the world one of the earliest legal codes, one of the earliest astronomical observatories, and one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. A wonder, as it turns out, that archaeology has never been able to locate within its walls. Today, the ruins of Babylon sit approximately 85 kilometers south of modern Baghdad, in what is now Iraq. They are real. They are accessible. They have been excavated, surveyed, photographed, and studied for a century. And yet, despite all of that, what lies beneath the currently excavated layers remains, in the precise technical language of archaeology, unreached. Not unfound, not missing, simply unreachable. Because the ancient city was built on a floodplain, because the Euphrates has shifted over millennia, because the water table in the region now sits at a level that floods any excavation attempt below approximately 2 meters beneath the current surface. The oldest Babylon, the Babylon of the early 2nd millennium BCE, the city that Hammurabi ruled when he issued his famous legal code around 1754 BCE, is sitting in groundwater. Has been sitting in groundwater for centuries, and no technology currently available to field archaeology can excavate a site that is permanently saturated with water without destroying the very stratigraphy, the layered record of occupation that makes the excavation meaningful. So it waits, as it has waited since Robert Koldewey stepped off a boat on the Euphrates in 1899 and looked at the mound that everyone knew was Babylon and began systematically to dig. Before we go underground, before we follow what Koldewey found and what he could not reach, take a moment to think about what that means. The city described in the book of Daniel, the city where the writing appeared on the wall, the city Nebuchadnezzar built as the center of his empire. Its oldest chapters are sitting in water, unread. And the archive of what we do know about Babylon, the layers that have been excavated, the objects that have been removed, the questions that have been answered, and the questions that have replaced them, is one of the most extraordinary archaeological stories in the history of human discovery. If you want to see how that story ends and where it stops, stay with us. And if you have never subscribed to Hist Discover, this is the archive where these stories live. Every file we open is like this one, something the textbooks described and something the textbooks left out. But before we get to what Koldewey found, before we get to the gate that ended up in Berlin and the garden that may never have existed where everyone thinks it did, there is a question worth pausing on. If the oldest layers of Babylon are underwater, if they have been physically unreachable for a century, what does that mean for everything we think we know about the city? How much of the Babylon story is built on evidence, and how much of it is built on the layers we could not reach? Drop a comment below if you already knew that the oldest layers of Babylon were underwater. I suspect most people watching this had no idea, because this is the kind of detail that does not make it into textbooks. To understand what archaeologists found beneath Babylon and what they could not reach, you need to understand what Babylon actually was at the height of its power. Not the Babylon of legend, the Babylon of documented history. Under Nebuchadnezzar II, who ruled from approximately 605 to 562 BCE, Babylon was, by most estimates, the largest city on Earth. Population estimates vary. Ancient population figures are always approximate, but researchers working from the documented area of the city and standard ancient urban density calculations suggest Babylon may have housed 100,000 to 200,000 people at its peak. For the ancient world, that number is extraordinary. The city was enclosed by a double wall system that ancient writers described with consistency, suggesting genuine familiarity. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, described walls wide enough for 2 chariots to pass each other on the road that ran along their top. Modern survey of the surviving wall foundations suggest the outer circuit enclosed an area of approximately 800 hectares. Within those walls, the city was organized around the Euphrates, which ran through its center, bridged by a structure that ancient sources described as one of the first major river bridges in the ancient world. The processional way, the main ceremonial avenue, ran from the city's northern gate southward through the heart of Babylon. It was paved with limestone and red breccia stone. Its walls, on either side, were decorated with glazed brick reliefs of lions, sacred to the goddess Ishtar, each approximately 2 meters in length. At the northern end of the processional way stood the Ishtar Gate, the gate that Robert Koldewey found, the gate that, in a decision that still generates discussion between Iraq and Germany, was removed from the site and reconstructed in the Pergamum Museum in Berlin, where it stands today. The original gate, glazed in brilliant lapis lazuli blue, stood approximately 14 meters high. Its surface was decorated with alternating rows of dragons, the symbol of Marduk, Babylon's chief deity, and bulls associated with the storm god Adad. These were not decorative choices made for beauty alone. They were theological statements made in glazed brick at a scale visible from outside the city. This was a city that understood architecture as communication, that understood the built environment as a language spoken to everyone who entered. And behind the Ishtar Gate, behind the processional way and the palace complex and the administrative quarters of the empire, rose the structure that most people associate with Babylon than any other, the ziggurat. Known in ancient texts as Eight Temenaki, a word that translates from Sumerian as house of the foundation of heaven and earth. Its dimensions, reconstructed from a cuneiform tablet now in the British Museum, suggest a square base of approximately 90 meters on each side. Its height is not precisely established. but the association between Temenaki and the biblical Tower of Babel, an association that many scholars consider plausible, though not universally accepted, has made it one of the most discussed structures in the history of biblical archaeology. The tower no longer stands. Its bricks were removed over centuries by builders who found the ancient site a convenient quarry. What Koldewey found when he arrived in 1899 was the foundation, and the foundation alone was enough to change everything he thought he knew about how large and how organized ancient Babylon had actually been. But Koldewey did not just find a gate. He found something beneath the gate, something in the stratigraphy of the site that raised a question he spent years trying to answer. A question about what Babylon was built on top of, and who was there before. The answer to that question is not what any textbook prepared him for, and it is not what most people watching this have ever been told. Robert Koldewey was a German architect and archaeologist who had spent years excavating sites in Greece and Italy before the German Oriental Society sent him to Babylon in 1899. He was methodical. He was patient, and he was, by the standards of his era, unusually rigorous in his documentation of what he found and where he found it. He spent 18 consecutive years at the site, what he excavated, working primarily in the layers associated with the Neo-Babylonian period, the era of Nebuchadnezzar, was substantial. The Ishtar Gate foundation and the glazed brick panels that allowed its reconstruction, the processional way, the southern citadel, the palace complex of Nebuchadnezzar, including what some researchers have associated with the vaulted structures potentially connected to the Hanging Gardens debate, the foundation of the Itamanaki ziggurat, the outline of the city's street plan, the double wall circuit, all of it documented in detail that remained the primary reference for Babylon scholarship for decades. But what Koldewey also documented, what appears in his excavation records in language that is careful but unmistakable, was the presence of earlier occupation beneath the Neo-Babylonian layers, older walls, older pottery, older architectural remains indicating settlement at the site extending back well before the period of Nebuchadnezzar. The site's history as a significant urban center appears from the archaeological record to extend back into the early 2nd millennium BCE, the period of Hammurabi's Law Code, approximately 1754 BCE, and potentially further. How much further is precisely the question that cannot be answered, because below a certain depth, below the layers Koldewey could access in the early 20th century with the drainage technology available to him, the excavation encountered water, groundwater, sitting in the ancient alluvial soil of the Mesopotamian floodplain at a level that has risen and shifted over millennia as the Euphrates changed course and the regional hydrology evolved. Koldewey documented this in his excavation reports. He noted, with the directness of a man who had spent 18 years dealing with a practical problem that had no practical solution, that the oldest layers of the site were not accessible, that the groundwater prevented penetration to the earliest occupation levels, that whatever Babylon was before it became the city of Nebuchadnezzar, whatever community or communities had settled this particular bend of the Euphrates and built it into a significant center over centuries before the Neo-Babylonian Empire, was sitting in water. This was in 1899. Modern excavation technology is more sophisticated than what Koldewey had available, but the fundamental problem has not changed. excavating a permanently waterlogged site without destroying the stratigraphy that makes the excavation meaningful requires techniques and resources that have not been applied to Babylon at scale. The oldest chapters of the most documented ancient city in history remain, as Koldewey left them, beneath the water table, unread. Now, before we get to the mystery that has generated more debate than any other question in Babylon scholarship, let us ask the archive a question that we want you to answer in the comments. What do you think would be found if those lower layers were ever excavated? A continuation of the city we know, or something that changes the story entirely? Write your answer below, because the next section of this archive suggests that the answer may be more surprising than either option. But the water table is not the only thing missing from the standard account of Babylon, because there is another absence at this site, an absence so famous that it has its own name, an absence that appears in every list of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, an absence that generations of archaeologists have searched for, and that no one in over a century of systematic excavation has ever found. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon, the most celebrated garden in history, described by ancient writers with consistency that suggests they believed they were describing something real, and not present, not a single identifiable stone at the city where every account says they stood. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon are listed among the 7 wonders of the ancient world. They are the only wonder whose location has never been confirmed by physical evidence. Ancient writers who described them include Diodorus Siculus, Strabo, and Quintus Curtius Rufus. Greek and Roman historians writing between the 1st century BCE and the 1st century AD. Their descriptions are consistent in certain details. A garden constructed on a raised structure, multiple terraces planted with trees and flowering plants, a complex irrigation system drawing water upward, possibly by a chain pump mechanism to keep the upper levels watered. The effect, according to ancient descriptions, was of a mountain of vegetation rising above the flat Mesopotamian plain. These descriptions exist. They are real texts written by real writers. The problem is the site. Koldewey excavated Babylon for 18 years. He identified and documented every major structure of the Neo-Babylonian city. He found the palace. He found the gate. He found the ziggurat foundation. He found the city walls. He did not find the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. More precisely, he found a vaulted structure in the northern part of the palace complex that he proposed cautiously as a possible candidate for the irrigation infrastructure associated with the gardens. That proposal has not gained wide acceptance among subsequent researchers. The site of the proposed gardens, as examined and re-examined over more than a century, has not yielded the kind of distinctive irrigation infrastructure, root systems in unusual locations, or soil chemistry associated with intensive elevated planting that one would expect if a massive terraced garden had occupied the space for any significant period. In 2013, a researcher named Stephanie Dalley, a cuneiformist at Oxford University, working from Assyrian cuneiform texts rather than Greek and Roman sources, published a peer-reviewed study through Oxford University Press. Her argument was precise. The ancient writers who described the Hanging Gardens were not describing Babylon. They were describing Nineveh, the capital of the Assyrian Empire, approximately 300 kilometers to the north. Dalley's evidence included a cuneiform text from Nineveh describing a royal garden with a complex water-lifting mechanism, an Archimedes-type mechanism, attributed to the Assyrian king Sennacherib. She argued that the Greek writers who described the gardens as Babylonian were working from sources that confused or conflated the two cities, both of which were, at different periods, the dominant power of Mesopotamia. Her hypothesis has not been universally accepted. It has been seriously engaged by other specialists. The question of where the Hanging Gardens actually stood, whether in Babylon, in Nineveh, or perhaps not in either location as we currently understand their extent, remains open in the academic literature. Which means this: the most celebrated garden in the ancient world, described by multiple writers across multiple centuries, has no confirmed physical location. It is a wonder whose wonder cannot be verified. And Babylon, the city that has carried its name for 2,000 years, has never produced the evidence that would confirm it was ever there. Before we move to the final, and in some ways most troubling chapter of what happened to Babylon, here is what we want you to consider. If the Hanging Gardens were actually in Nineveh, if the most famous feature of the most famous city in history was misattributed for 2,000 years, what does that tell us about how reliably ancient accounts describe ancient places? Think about that. And subscribe to Hist Discover if you want the next file. Because the next section of this archive involves Babylon in a time that is not ancient at all. It involves events that happened in 2003 and damage that 2,000 years of history did not produce, but a single year did. In March 2003, coalition forces entered Iraq. Within weeks, a military base was established in the immediate vicinity of the ancient ruins of Babylon. It housed, at its peak, approximately 2,000 soldiers. Helicopters landed, vehicles moved, earth was moved. Sand was filled into bags from the archaeological deposits. When the base was vacated, UNESCO conducted a formal assessment. The report, published in 2009, documented damage to the Babylon site. Some of it was to structures that had survived for more than 2,000 years. Babylon had survived Alexander the Great. It had survived the Parthian Empire. It had survived the Sassanid Empire. It had survived the Islamic conquest. It had survived the Mongol invasion of the 13th century. It had survived being a quarry for subsequent builders who removed its bricks for centuries. And then, in the space of approximately 18 months, it sustained damage that UNESCO characterized as, in certain specific locations, irreversible. The full UNESCO report is available online. It is not a comfortable document to read. And what it says about what was damaged and what was lost permanently is the final chapter of what this archive has to tell you about what lies beneath Babylon, and what no longer does. The UNESCO report on Babylon was published in 2009. It was compiled following a formal assessment of the site conducted after the military base was vacated. The report is available online. It runs to several hundred pages, and it documents, in the careful language of heritage conservation specialists, what happened to Babylon between 2003 and 2004. The damage falls into several categories: compaction. Military vehicles and foot traffic across the site compressed archaeological deposits that had remained undisturbed for centuries. Compacted soil cannot be excavated in the same way as undisturbed soil. The stratigraphic information, the layered record of what was deposited when, is partially destroyed by compression. Sand extraction. Sandbags were filled using soil from the archaeological site. Soil from an ancient site is not neutral fill material. It contains pottery fragments, organic material, and microscopic evidence that can be analyzed for information about the people who lived there. When that soil was scooped into sandbags, that information was either destroyed or rendered uncontextualizable. Direct damage to ancient structures. The report documents specific instances of damage to ancient brickwork, bricks that, in some cases, bear the stamp of Nebuchadnezzar himself. Bricks that had survived in place for over 2,500 years. The report characterizes certain categories of damage as irreversible, not recoverable with future technology, simply gone. Babylon had survived, as I told you in the last section, Alexander the Great, the Mongol invasion, and centuries of use as a quarry. Now I want you to think about that list for a moment and leave a comment below telling me which of those threats you think caused the most long-term damage to the site. Because the answer, based on the archaeological record, is not necessarily the one most people would guess. And the UNESCO report's conclusions about 2003 are part of that answer. But the 2003 damage, significant as it is not the last word on Babylon. Because Babylon is still there. The ruins are still accessible. Archaeological work has continued, interrupted but not ended. And what researchers working at the site in the years since have found, and what they are still trying to understand, is the subject of active, ongoing scholarly work. Which means the archive on Babylon is not closed. It is simply incomplete, the way all archives on ancient sites are incomplete. And this one specifically may remain incomplete for a very long time. Babylon is approximately 4,000 years old. It was the largest city on Earth for roughly 200 years. It was the setting for some of the most significant events in the biblical narrative. It was the backdrop for one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, a wonder whose location, as Stephanie Dalley's 2013 research suggests, may not have been in Babylon at all. Its oldest layers have been underwater and unreachable since the first systematic excavation began in 1899. Its surface layers sustained damage in 2003 that UNESCO characterized as irreversible in certain areas. And yet, the site continues to be studied. The Iraqi State Board of Antiquities and Heritage has been working to preserve and document what remains. International teams have conducted survey work using non-invasive methods, ground-penetrating radar, aerial photogrammetry, satellite imaging, that do not require excavation and do not disturb the surviving deposits. These methods are revealing the outline of structures that have not yet been excavated, buildings whose walls can be traced from above without a single trowel being put in the ground. Rooms, streets, storage areas. The ghost of the city still present in the soil, readable now by instruments that Koldewey could not have imagined. The oldest layers remain underwater, but the layers that are accessible are not yet fully read. And every year the tools available to read them become more precise. Subscribe to Hist Discover if you want to follow what those tools are finding, because the Babylon story, the real one, the one built on excavation reports and cuneiform texts and UNESCO assessments, is still being written, and it is more interesting than any version that has ever appeared in a textbook. Babylon is still there, 85 kilometers south of Baghdad, on the same plain where Nebuchadnezzar built his palace, where Alexander the Great walked the processional way and never left, where Robert Koldewey spent 18 years and still could not reach the bottom. The Ishtar Gate that stood at its northern entrance is in Berlin. The bricks stamped with Nebuchadnezzar's name are in museums across Europe and North America. The lower city, The Babylon that existed before any of the empires, before any of the accounts that history has preserved, is sitting in water beneath the site, unreachable, unread. And somewhere in the soil between what has been excavated and what cannot be reached, in the layers that ground-penetrating radar can outline but no trowel can yet open, the questions that Koldewey first identified in 1899 are still waiting. Before you leave this archive, one question. If you could excavate one layer of Babylon, if you could choose what to look for, what would it be? The oldest city beneath the water table? The real location of the Hanging Gardens? What was in Nebuchadnezzar's palace the night Alexander the Great died? Leave your answer below. Every comment tells us which file to open next. The archive does not close on Babylon. It only notes that Babylon has been waiting 4,000 years. It can wait a little longer. Subscribe to Hist Discover. The next file is already open.